This show is not propagandized nor corporatized, and we need your help to keep it going. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/actout to support independent activist news from the front lines. This week, from toxic prisons to the cruelty of solitary confinement, we're digging deep into the prison industrial complex, uncovering human rights violations and highlighting the fight for both people and planet. And finally, Future Farmers seeks to deconstruct how you think about food, land, and the whole political system that you live under, using urban planning, grain, and art. But first, into the oubliette. Oubliette, from the French, to forget. A secret dungeon hole where evil minds, the sickly kind, and those that don't walk lines will go. No one knows save those that do, and they will never say where you are or speak your name. A cave, something like a 6x8. No light, no sound, the emptiness profound. The mind unwinds and you will wrap yourself with every scrap. Hold on to the holes that grow with every gap of time, the days, the weeks. I'm running out of mind. Play, rewind, fast forward, please. Forward, please, time. Rewind. The soul then bows, bends to catch your break, but how far can we twist and turn? The fault lines in me quake. A shattered mass like this won't last. Hope and dread repass. Do days still pass? Does sun still shine? Do people there outside remember the forgotten? Now and then think of us, we, the state marked rotten? If doing time pays for crime, how can mine be timed? In a place where nothing moves, the grooves just skip, rewind. And if a crime's committed, though it's been admitted, that here in holes are those whose sole crime is place in time, wrong on both, and also those who simply walked offline, marched and raised a fist, boldly said, fuck this. Yes, all of these and then some more, throw them in the hole. And to my question, this rejection of reason, logic, oh, what do you hope to create? By treating man like monster, foster hate and soul decay, then sell it as the righteous way, the only way to rehabilitate. And here no need to complicate or contemplate. I have racked my mind of late, seeking reason in those same sick holes, where treason against our own human soul is in supply like dark and cold, simple, simply gold. Yes, we are so adept, lest that we forget, at torture, hate, greed, and death. We lock our own in dank, dark holes, a 6x8 edict made, systemic slaves rife with mankind's worst of traits, sign along a dotted line and lock a mind, a soul and kind, in a pit, an oubliette, where no sun shines, and the only wind that blows is thought that leaps from aching minds, echo. And in the halls of gold, the dotted line that bought this crime, the worst of humankind, echoes back, alone. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. This week, as per the spoken word, we're talking primarily about prisons, the prison industrial complex. And this weekend, some unique and important actions are happening regarding said prison industrial complex. So, let's jump straight to the front lines and talk toxic prisons. So there's the environmental movement, and then there's the prison reform movement, but rarely do we see these two movements intersect, even in a philosophical sense. But on June 11th, these two movements will not only intersect, they will organize together, discuss and plan together, and execute a direct action on Monday, June 13th, at the Bureau of Prisons here in D.C., condemning toxic prisons, and in particular, a $444 million proposed federal prison to be built on a former mountaintop removal coal mining site in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. And that is but one example, the most recent and currently pressing. Fight Toxic Prisons is a coalition of organizations that fight against the overarching prison industrial complex, with a particular focus on the intersectionality of environmental justice and prisoner rights. In a nutshell, prison pollution affects the basic human and civil rights of prisoners. It's certainly no secret, oh hello son, it's certainly no secret that this system gives less than no shits about the well-being of the poor, black, and brown. Now consider the poor, black, and brown that are in jail. Really no fucks given. Combine this with the seldom discussed issue of eco-prisoners, i.e. those in prison for their actions in defense of the earth, and you have the keystone of Fight Toxic Prisons. And June 11th, by the way, also holds particular importance as the 12th annual day of action in solidarity with eco-anarchists and the continued push to shorten sentences and win early release for incarcerated environmentalists. Which, I might add, you can commemorate this year by going to bat for one of our former guests on this show, Heather Doyle. She was sentenced to more jail time last week after speaking out against police brutality and harassment after originally being sentenced for fighting the fracked gas export facility on the coast at Cove Point. You can spread the word about her case by visiting facebook.com/wearecovepoint. Now, with regard to toxic prisons themselves, you might be wondering what exactly that means. Well, since it's one of the hot topics of the weekend, let's start by taking a look at the proposed federal prison in Kentucky. So, the land where it's slated to be built is nestled pretty much directly on the former site of a disastrous fossil fuel project, surrounded by sludge ponds and coal processing operations, offering up a high-risk cocktail, if you will, of contaminated water and radon exposure. But I mean, why cry over sludge not yet spilt on prisoners? How about eco-prisoner Eric McDavid's description of his prison time? Quote, "We knew we were held on a Superfund site at FCI Victorville, our only water contaminated with heavy metals and the very air we breathed laden with toxic dust." FYI, the fun-sounding Superfund site is, quote, "any land in the United States that has been contaminated by hazardous waste and identified by the EPA as a candidate for cleanup because it poses a risk to human health and or the environment." So, seeing that the EPA was tagged in that definition, I decided to dig a little bit deeper and see if I could find Victorville's listed on the EPA's Superfund page. And what do you know? Former George Air Force Base, training facility, and convenient storage space for hazardous chemicals involved in military training, used between World War II and 1992. Under contaminants and risk, the EPA notes, quote, "groundwater is contaminated with jet fuel, trichloroethylene, TCE, pesticides, and nitrates. Soil is contaminated with total petroleum, hydrocarbons, dioxins, construction debris, medical wastes, pesticides, semi-volatile organic compounds, and various inorganic compounds." Wow. One man's trash is apparently the prison industrial complex's treasure. USP Victorville Federal Prison, where Eric McDavid was held, is literally right on that land, even just blatantly located right off Air Base Road. They don't even fucking try to hide it. And again, as you might have noticed, these are sites that are deemed uninhabitable because they pose a risk to human health and the environment. And it's not just Superfund sites that are ripe for prison construction. How about Rikers, the infamous prison just outside New York City? Now, you may have heard of its infamy because of the horrendous cases of inmate abuse, including juveniles. But did you also know that the island itself is a fucking health hazard? Built on an old landfill, simply the stench of the island is enough to make people sick, which it does. In fact, a group of corrections officers are involved in a suit claiming that the pollution on Rikers actually gave them cancer. And that's just the correction officers? A former inmate who now also suffers from respiratory problems reported that it smelled like, quote, "sewer mixed with fertilizer mixed with death." Which is actually pretty accurate, but that's not all. As the garbage does its best to decompose, it belches methane into the air, and if you recall from a recent methane leak in California, that is a severe health hazard. Furthermore, less than a mile away in Queens sit 5 power plants that spew volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide, a pollutant. The Paletti Power Plant, infamous for being the biggest polluter in New York, sat within a mile of Rikers and operated until 2010 when it closed due to community pressure. Since then, 2 power plants have replaced it. On the other side, within a mile, sit 4 waste transfer stations and a compressor station in the Bronx. The island is also home to its own power plant that provides energy for the jail facility. The power plant on Rikers emitted 8,650 pounds of a dangerous pollutant, PM2.5, solid airborne particles that are 2.5 microns or smaller, and 9,435 pounds of PM10 in 2014. One of the operating power plants within a mile from Rikers has had at least 13 violations of the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act in the past 10 years. Along with power plants, waste transfer stations, like the one nearby in the Bronx, are also known for a high amount of particulate matter emissions due to the high number of trucks emitting diesel exhaust. Add to this frequent water shutoffs due to the prison literally sinking into landfill waste, causing pipes to buckle and crack, little to no air conditioning in inmate areas, and you have yourself a literal toxic heap of human rights violations and environmental hazards at an institution supposedly built to rehabilitate people. Or how about the Intercept article that came out last week reporting that during a one-year period ending January 15th of this year, OSHA received 81 workplace safety complaints regarding mold in penal institutions across the United States. And again, that's complaints from the workers, who obviously aren't there 24/7. And all of this that I've mentioned is but a fraction, a few examples of toxic prisons. You can find more on the Prison Ecology map page, which we'll post a link to in the description, and although the convergence itself will be happening in DC, people around the country can join the fight against toxic prisons by contributing to the movement, organizing solidarity direct actions at or around prisons in your area, and getting in touch with action organizers. Visit fighttoxicprisons.org to learn more and to get involved. We'll also bring you some footage from the event itself, so tune in next week for that. But for now, let's talk about another brand of prison toxicity: solitary confinement. In reality, this segment really deserves the Low-Life Scum Award as well.
You low-life scum.
Thank you. Due to activist work both on the inside and the outside, this Low-Life Scum story is also a Frontlines report. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the low-life scum aspect of solitary confinement, often called segregation or administrative confinement, or AC, by the folks in the biz who like to sugarcoat evil. As I mentioned in the spoken word earlier, the cells are typically somewhere around 6 by 8 feet, oftentimes outfitted with steel doors and solid walls where neither light nor sound penetrates. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day and are sometimes, but not always, allowed an hour of quote-unquote recreation, where they are taken to another cell and essentially walked around in shackles. The original idea behind solitary confinement was to punish prisoners who were particularly violent, keeping them in solitary for a few days, maybe even up to a week, as punishment. And I would argue that even that is some fucked up torture bullshit, but that is nothing compared to what solitary confinement has become. Human Rights Watch reports that no longer a matter of spending a week in the hole, prisoners classified as dangerous or disruptive can spend years and even decades in solitary confinement. And with regards to who gets classified as dangerous or disruptive, your guess is really as good as mine, because there is no standard or rule, and there's certainly no oversight. The criteria for determining entry to and exit from administrative segregation, particularly in super maximum security facilities, are so vague that arbitrariness and unfairness are inevitable. Few jurisdictions have careful internal review systems to provide an effective check on unnecessary or unduly prolonged solitary confinement. Moreover, few states have an impartial and independent authority, such as an ombudsman or inspector general, who can monitor supermax conditions and provide inmates with an effective recourse against unnecessary or unduly lengthy solitary confinement. So really, you can get thrown in the hole just because a dickhead guard doesn't like you, or because you were tied to a disruption general population and no one cares enough to see if that's true or not. And if you're mentally ill, much like on the outside, prisons either have no resources to care for you or don't want to, or a combination of the two. So the easiest thing to do is just to shove you in the hole. Again, Human Rights Watch estimates that anywhere from 1/5 to 2/3 of prisoners held in solitary confinement have a serious mental illness, which was diagnosed or manifested before isolation. And while no one will argue that prisons are ill-equipped in everything from clean air to mental health services, the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law wrote in a 2010 report that, quote, segregation of mentally ill prisoners, or any other prisoner, is not an unintended consequence of tight budgets, for example. It reflects a penal philosophy and the conscious decision by prison officials about whom to isolate, for how long, and under what conditions. The authors go on to write that it is the ethical duty of health professionals to advocate against solitary confinement, to not turn a blind eye to the clear and documented effects of solitary, which include anxiety, depression, anger, cognitive disturbances, perceptual distortions, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, and psychosis. The adverse effects of solitary confinement are especially significant for persons with serious mental illness, commonly defined as a major mental disorder, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, that is usually characterized by psychotic symptoms and/or significant functional impairments. The stress, lack of meaningful social contact, and unstructured days can exacerbate symptoms of illness or provoke recurrence. Suicides occur disproportionately more often in segregation units than elsewhere in prison. All too frequently, mentally ill prisoners decompensate in isolation, requiring crisis care or psychiatric hospitalization. The article goes on to cite examples of prisons that do not utilize solitary, and lo and behold, prisoners respond more favorably to, say, group therapy than to being locked in a dark fucking hole for 23 hours a day. And while solitary confinement for youth was banned earlier this year, thousands of prisoners still suffer the extreme psychological torture that accompanies this practice. And a handful of those are at Wupan Correctional Institute in Wisconsin. Starting this Friday, June 10th, prisoners at WCI will begin a hunger strike in protest of solitary confinement. Cesar de Leon, a prisoner who is currently serving in solitary, described the conditions in a press release. Prisoners in solitary at WCI are never allowed to go outside or see the sun. The 1 hour per day of recreation that they're allowed out of their bathroom-sized cells is spent in an indoor recreation cage, which is often filthy with urine and feces because once a prisoner is moved to the cage, requests to be allowed access to the bathroom are ignored by staff. Prisoners in administrative confinement, AC, are not only extraordinarily isolated from general population, but also from loved ones and spiritual leaders. AC prisoners are allowed one 15-minute phone call and one 15-minute video visit per week. The calls and conferences are closely monitored and can be cut off with very little pretext. And if you recall from episode 63, video visitations are more often than not embarrassingly low quality and unreliable. The only human interaction that these prisoners have is with prison guards, oftentimes the original cause of their confinement. In conjunction with the hunger strike, supporters are organizing 2 rallies, one in Madison and one in Milwaukee, on June 10th and 11th, respectively, where life-size replicas of the tiny cells will be on display, and family members, activists, and legislators will speak out in support of the strikers and against solitary confinement. There will also be a letter writing and phone pressure campaign to support the demands of the prisoners, which include an end to solitary confinement, the implementation of an oversight committee to stop abuse of prisoners, and the establishment of proper mental health facilities and treatment of short and long-term solitary confinement prisoners. To learn more about the events this coming weekend in Wisconsin and read first-person accounts of solitary, go to solitarytorture.blogspot.com. And finally today, for something completely different. Amy Franceschini is using art to deconstruct how we think about food and, indeed, political systems as a whole. Her project, Future Farmers, is tackling everything from urban planning to art installations in the name of human connection with food and land. Take a look.
We're mostly interested in politics or activity around food production. And it is definitely a concern about the natural environment, but it's also a concern about the social politics connected to food and who is growing our food and for whom and by whom, and how that food is consumed, produced, and distributed.
Talk a little bit about how that translates into your art. This interest in systems, the deconstruction, and the political aspect of our relationship to food.
To be honest, we operate in the art world because it's still a place that seems to be the most open. And I almost sometimes feel like we get away with doing urban planning or politics through the art world. So, for instance, right now we've been working in Oslo for 5 years on a permanent public artwork in a new waterfront development. And that's totally politically contentious, right? It's this massive development project. There's the first part of that project was a series of banks. What we proposed was to use a common area in this waterfront that was quite derelict, and they were just kind of leaving it to the side for 20 years until they finished the big opera house, the National Museum, the Munch Museum. And we kind of secretly knew that if we chose a place that wasn't really looked at for a few years, that we might be able to get away with some things and actually get some roots there and change the face of the development in this area. But we've started an urban farm. There's a community garden, which was the starting community. And now we're building a permanent building called a bakehouse. So it has 3 different ovens that you can bake in, and it has a greenhouse. So we also wrote in 2007, I did a similar project in San Francisco called Victory Gardens. And through that project, we wrote a city ordinance that the city adopted, which said they would spend more money on urban agriculture and all of these kind of reasons why, a whole charter. We sent it to Oslo to propose that they should adopt it. And when the political system changed in September, they actually adopted that policy into their new green government agenda, like verbatim, which was amazing. So again, like through the back door of the art world, I think when we're invited into a situation, we kind of look for where there's a gap or cracks in the master plans and try to enter through the back door.
That's really fascinating. It reminds me of the situation in Canada where a man created an art project on his land so that a pipeline wouldn't go through it and then copyrighted it.
Yes.
So this is really about the intersectionality of art and creativity in so many different mediums. I mean, a bakehouse, a lot of people wouldn't consider that to be an art project, and yet the Flatbread Society is what it's called, right? Is this intersectionality of so many different mediums, and with this political goal. So I also want to ask you, grain seems to be present in a lot of different installations and projects that you do, from the mast acting as sort of a grain silo, the land grant that chronicles our relationship to grain. So what is it about grain specifically, as opposed to other fruits or vegetables or things like that that really speaks to the future farmer's ideology?
In Norway, they actually call flatbread a storage economy, because it was actually how they would store their grains for the year, and they would bake it in these flat, round pieces with a hole in the middle and then hang them in the ceiling for the winter. And it actually kind of looks like currency or like data when it's hanging up there. And so I started reading more about the history of grain, and just like the history of grain as it's related to the idea of civilization. And something we wanted to do here within this capital project of this waterfront was have a place that we can question, like, where have we come from, where are we now, and we're in this highly civilized waterfront development. What have we gained? So some things that have come out of the project already is a question of local currency or a trade economy, and to demonstrate it and test it out within the context of Flatbread Society.
So how do you see this progressing past this waterfront? Are you going to do other? Is there an impetus to do other such projects, permanent projects, in other places?
So we've been invited to do projects in Istanbul and in Moscow, but the last kind of aspect of this project is this September we've been growing these ancient grains on the field, and that's pretty much a centerpiece of the urban farm, is this old grain field. And all the grains that we've been growing there were kind of thought to be extinct in the early 1900s. And then in the 70s were found in strange places, like one of the rye we're growing was found between two boards and a roof of a sauna. But we have 9 different varieties like that have been found in strange places. And we're taking them this September on a boat, which will go all the way around the western side of Europe and the Atlantic, down through the Mediterranean to Palestine, and then to Istanbul, to retrace this movement of the grains to the Nordic part of the world. And so through that, what we're trying to do is carry these questions that we started asking here to different localities. So every place we stop along the way is a group of seed savers or small-scale farmers who are, kind of fighting to survive and protecting these seeds and keeping them out of the industrialized agricultural landscape. So as you might know, in about 3 summers ago, the EU tried to pass a law that farmers were only allowed to grow certified seeds. And there was huge demonstrations, and that law has been stopped, but there's still like a fear of, that might encroach again. So that project is called the Seed Journey, Flatbread Society Seed Journey. The Seed Journey is like carrying these questions and then activating them into a more documentary space.
So finally, I want to ask you, because you've talked a little bit about like the there's waterfront that has the community or the banks, and there's these new architectural projects springing up. There's the EU ruling on seeds, and the GMO fight is still very present in both the US and the EU. And meanwhile, there's a lot of push for urban farming, both obviously in the EU and in the US. Talk about these two parallel tracks, and where do you think that, we've seen where the past is, and you guys are doing sort of artistic representation of retracing those steps. What about the future?
I learn most from small-scale farmers who are affected by politics, global warming, and just how hard it is to farm. And I think what I've learned from them is to create durable and robust local economies. So I feel like the future is going to be more focused on localism rather than globalism. Of course, they're totally tied together. I do think just that we have to revalue our relationships to the place we live and the people that we're surrounded by.
For more information on Future Farmers, visit futurefarmers.com. And that does it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As always, check out the last slide to see all the sites that I mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the partly cloudy Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.